All right, let's talk about new Keynesian economics. It's this super influential theory that tries to answer a really big question. Why do our incredibly powerful modern economies still get stuck in these really messy situations?
And that question is really the starting point for all of this. I mean, think about it. If markets are supposed to be these efficient, self-correcting machines, why on earth do we sometimes see millions of people who desperately want to work but just can't find a job? You know, this isn't just some academic puzzle. It's a huge, real-world problem that economists have been wrestling with for the better part of a century.
So, to really get to the bottom of it, here's the journey we're going to take. We'll start with that big unemployment puzzle. Then we'll look at the radical idea that John Maynard Keynes came up with. We'll see how that idea got challenged, and then how this new Keynesian school of thought popped up to kind of build a bridge. Then we're going to get into the really interesting stuff, the nitty-gritty of why prices get stuck. And finally, we'll see why any of this still matters in the economic debates we're having today. Okay, so our story really kicks off during a massive moment of crisis, the Great Depression back in the 1930s. And this wasn't just some run-of-the-mill recession. It was a complete economic disaster that the big theories of the time, well, they just couldn't explain it. You see, the classical view was actually pretty elegant and simple. It said that if you have a lot of unemployment, that just means the price of labor, wages, is too high. So logically, wages should fall, and then companies will hire more people. The problem should solve itself, right? The market's supposed to find its own balance. But during the Great Depression, unemployment just stayed crazy high for years, even when wages were falling. The theory and the reality were just completely out of sync. Something was missing. And that's when this guy, John Maynard Keynes, steps onto the scene. He looked at this absolute catastrophe and suggested something that, for the time, was totally out there. He basically said, hey, what if that core assumption we have, that prices and wages are super flexible and self-correcting, what if that's just wrong? Keynes came up with this idea of sticky prices and wages. He argued that in the real world, wages and prices don't just instantly drop to a new perfect level. They resist change, they're sluggish, and it's this stickiness that allows for these long, painful periods of involuntary unemployment, where people are out of a job not because they don't want to work, but because the whole economic system is kind of gummed up. Now, for a few decades, Keynes's ideas were pretty much king. But then, around the 1970s, a new group of thinkers, the new classicals, came along, and they asked a really tough and, frankly, a very fair question. They said, okay, fine, we can see that prices might be sticky in the real world, but your theory doesn't tell us why. Why would a rational, profit-hungry company not just lower its prices to sell more stuff when no one's buying? So here's the real clash of ideas. The old-school Keynesians just sort of assumed that prices were sticky. The new classicals, on the other hand, demanded what they called micro-foundations. They wanted a theory that started from the ground up, with rational people and rational companies, and then showed exactly how their smart choices would somehow lead to this weird, sticky economy. It was a huge intellectual showdown. And this is where our story really gets going. New Keynesian economics rose up to meet that exact challenge. You can think of it as a synthesis, really, an attempt to build a bridge between these two camps. It tried to take the core, brilliant insight from Keynes, but build it on the solid, rigorous foundation that the new classicals were demanding. So the new Keynesian approach doesn't just toss out the idea that people are rational. No, it leans right into it. It basically says, okay, let's assume everyone is smart and trying to do what's best for themselves. Now, what happens when we put those smart people into the real world, a world with imperfect information and messy markets? What kind of economy do their rational decisions actually create? And it turns out the answer is a sticky one. Okay, so let's get right to the heart of it. Let's dig into the specific reasons, those micro-foundations we talked about, that the new Keynesians came up with to explain why a totally rational economy can still get stuck in the mud. The new Keynesians actually identified a bunch of concrete reasons for this stickiness. You've got things like staggered contracts, where not everyone's wages get set at the same time, which creates a kind of inertia. Or imperfect information, where nobody really has a perfect crystal ball to see what's happening in the economy. But I want to focus on one idea that's especially powerful, this concept of efficiency wages. Let's just walk through this. It's actually super intuitive. Imagine you're a manager and the economy's in a downturn. The old textbook says you should cut everybody's pay. But wait, you know that if you do that, your best, most productive people might just walk out the door and go to a competitor. And what about the ones who stay? Well, their morale is going to tank and their productivity is going to go right down with it.
So, as a totally rational manager, you might decide it's actually cheaper in the long run to keep wages where they are and just lay some people off instead. And boom, that's a rational choice that makes wages sticky on the way down. So, you see, all these little decisions being made by thousands of individual managers, they add up to have these massive economy-wide consequences. Because prices and wages don't just smoothly adjust on their own, the economy can't always fix itself. And this puts people like central bankers and governments in a really, really tough spot.
This really gets at the core dilemma that policymakers are always facing. Because of all this stickiness, they're stuck with this difficult trade-off. In simple terms, if a central bank tries to juice the economy to lower unemployment, they run the risk of kicking off inflation. But if they slam on the brakes to fight inflation, they risk causing a recession and, you guessed it, more unemployment. There's just no perfect, easy answer, and that is a direct result of the sticky world that the new Keynesians describe.
And that brings us right up to today. Because this body of theory isn't just some dusty old idea from a textbook. It is, for all intents and purposes, the intellectual foundation for how most major central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the US, think about and try to manage the economy every single day.
So when we boil it all down, what are the big takeaways here? Well, first, that core Keynesian idea holds up. Sticky prices are a real thing, and they can cause a lot of pain in the form of unemployment. Second, new Keynesianism gives us the why, the rational reasons for that stickiness. And because of that, it provides a really strong argument for why governments and central banks should play an active role in trying to smooth out the economy's bumps. But it's not a perfect theory, and critics are quick to point out that for all its smarts, it really didn't see the huge 2008 financial crisis coming.
I think this quote from two major thinkers in this field, Bruce Greenwald and Joseph Stiglitz, just captures the whole spirit of new Keynesianism perfectly. It admits that, yeah, markets can fail, that the invisible hand can be palsied, but it's also incredibly pragmatic. It recognizes that government intervention isn't some magic cure-all and can actually make things worse sometimes. It's really a call for humility when you're dealing with something as complex as the economy.
And that really leaves us with the ultimate question that's at the heart of just about every economic debate we have. In this messy, imperfect world we live in, how do we find that right balance between letting the market do its thing and having the government step in? It's the huge puzzle that new Keynesianism helps us understand a little bit better, even if it can't give us the final answer. Thanks so much for digging into this with me.